Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative questions of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Geoffrey, and I'm a Methodist minister based in Putney in southwest London. Before I was ordained, I spent 10 years working in the House of Commons as a clerk, and I'm committed to connecting how we pray and read our scriptures to how we vote and live. Each week, I'm joined by a guest from a different place on the pulpit and political landscape. And today, I'm very pleased to introduce the Reverend Lucy Berry. Lucy is an ex-advertising writer, art therapist, and performance poet. She was poet in residence for 4 years on BBC Radio 2's The Jeremy Vine Show before training for ordination in the United Reformed Church. She's a mum in a mixed heritage family, currently writing a book about preaching. And we'll talk a bit more about that later, perhaps. She has worked with prisoners' wives and taught in prison, and although straight, she is a founding trustee of the Open Table Network, a charity that helps establish, within welcoming host churches, safe, loving, LGBTQIA-led worship communities. Lucy, it's lovely to have you with us today, and look forward to hearing all about and some of the insights you bring as a poet to these readings today. But may I begin, like as with all our other guests, by asking you, we know that politics can be a bit of a contentious topic in the pulpit. When you hear people saying that politics shouldn't form part of our preaching, what's your response?
So, thank you very much for having me. The first thing I did when I heard that I was being invited on was to go away and look at the definition of politics. And that is activities associated with the governance of a country or area, and especially the debate between parties having power. Now, I don't mean political parties, but parties having power you see all the way through the Bible. The second one is activities aimed at improving someone's status or increasing power within an organization. That's very interesting as well, because obviously that happens everywhere, including church. And then lastly, the word politic, which you hear very seldom, which means sensible and judicious. So I was interested in this massive shift that had happened from sensible and judicious to powerful and often contentious and often corrupt and very often self-interested, which had happened. And we assume politics is almost, well, it's either a neutral word or a dirty word. It's never a polite word, is it? And yet politic is a lovely, lovely word. So that was the first thing I did. I think if we're talking big politics, as opposed to party politics, then we have to talk about it all the time, because it's the sensible and judicious fight against evil that goes on all the time in the world and has to be explored in our texts. I think that's how I would respond.
Yes. And it's wonderful as a poet and somebody who's so good at shaping language. Your first response was to go to the meaning of the word, which is so important. And perhaps we could have a few more politicians, perhaps.
The trouble is, a politician isn't a sexy one, you know. No. They're some of the ones I can think of. There was an incredibly elderly chap who many people won't remember, called Alec Douglas Hume, who was conservative, which is not my rave, but who was very, very politic and rather charming and so boring that it was difficult to stay awake. So, you know, as we move further and further into media and social media, politics is getting, well, we can see, can't we, around the world, how extraordinary it's getting.
Yes. And it's been interesting, actually, that idea of boring politicians, because one of my reflections from Parliament is people focused so much on the half hour of Prime Minister's question times, but so much of politics is the boring stuff that goes on in the committee rooms, the detailed word-by-word analysis of legislation, That is what matters. That is actually what affects people's lives. And it's been interesting in recent years how some countries have deliberately gone to boring politicians. I forget, in Italy, they went for a technocrat because after all the excitement of Berlusconi, they realized, people, sometimes I think, sometimes boring is good because it means they're doing the job. But yes, very hard to sell that.
Yes.
Before we plunge into our readings and consider about the role of boring people in politics, perhaps, just a quick roundup of the news. And there's a news story that by the time this goes out may well have changed, because we're all waiting to hear the outcome of discussions between Rishi Sunak and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who's coming to Windsor, meeting Windsor at the minute, trying to hammer out a trade agreement over Northern Ireland, a very contentious but very important issue. Yesterday, we had the tragic news that at least 59 refugees had died as their boat carrying them to Italy crashed and sank just off the coast. And the worrying news that Ofgem has set a new energy price cap, pressurising the government to offer more support to bill payers ahead of the rise in April. And added to that, we are, of course, in the church season, the Christian season of Lent. We're now settled into our Lenten observances, and we're also marking Fair Trade Fortnight up until the 12th of March. Friday is the World Day of Prayer, which will be marked across the country in different ways. And that's followed next week on the 8th of March by International Women's Day. So with all that in mind, and with our metaphorical newspapers in one hand and our real Bibles in the other, we turn to our reading set for this coming Sunday, the second Sunday in Lent. And we've got some good meaty readings this week. We've got Genesis 12, the call of Abraham, Romans chapter 4, where Paul reflects on that call, John chapter 3, and Psalm 121. So, Lucy, where would you like to start this week?
I think we have to start in Genesis, because Abraham, later to become Abraham, has just done precisely what he's been asked by God to do. And he has, at the age of 75, and I'm not 75, but I would find it difficult to move into the wilderness at this stage of my life. He's setting off with everybody to begin away from home and away from everything he knows and trusting God. And I think that's, the reason that the Bible is based on Abraham, and we keep going back to Abraham, even when we're only mention him in passing, is because his was the first great act of faith. So interesting. And of course, the promise of, that he would be the father of,
Yes.
nations.
Yes. And and do you wish to go straight to Romans, or which links that to that idea of faith and stepping out in faith?
You see, I'm interested in
That's what I thought.
In how we deal with Romans and how we deal with the other reading, the John reading, because Paul in Romans is talking about law and faith. For the promise that he would inherit the world did not come to Abraham or to his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. And then Jesus in John is not talking about law. He's talking about earth and heaven. I find Paul and Jesus so fascinating to look at together as people explaining life to us, because Jesus doesn't use law and faith. He uses, to Nicodemus at any rate, heaven and earth. Heaven being, I believe, not something that he believes is always far away, but that is actually a way of living. You know, the heavenly way of living, which is the kingdom now and the kingdom not yet. You know, these glimpses of the kingdom that he's talking about. So I think that I'm interested in that Jesus is not making a separation between earth and heaven that we often make. Whereas I think that probably Paul, with his faith and his law, is making this huge separation between faith and law.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting chatting each week to a different preacher. And we were saying sometimes you look at the lectionary readings and you think, oh, yes, I can see exactly the link here. Very easy. Yes, exactly. And it's been very interesting to see how different preachers get the different links. Today, we seem to have two readings that deal with Abraham, the call of Abraham, and then this encounter with Jesus and Nicodemus. How would you be tempted to sort of treat them separately or unite them together in some common theme, do you think?
There is a common theme, because the common, I mean, sometimes you look at the lectionary and you think, I wonder what they're doing here, because I can't see.
Yes, yeah.
What they're doing, and they're being very esoteric. And most ministers and vicars are not going to be able to get this. And then and then other times you think, oh yeah. I don't think it's this clear, or rather I think it needs unpacking more than it sometimes does. Of course, the first reading is just showing us what Abraham has done, this massive leap of faith. Must have been a leap. And then this excitement of Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as a righteousness. Now, to one who works and wages are not reckoned as a gift, but something due. The idea that righteousness has its own reward. That's very, very Paul, isn't it? And it's very Jesus as well. But then it goes on to, I suppose what I'm trying to say is, Paul is a lawyer. He thinks in law. He grew up in the law. Even after he was knocked off his horse and blinded, he's still using the law. He's still coming from the law. Jesus is coming from love first, because he says, doesn't he? The law, all the law and the prophets are in love thy neighbor as thyself and love thy God. I did a sermon once where all I did was look at pictures. I was working in a multicultural church where English was sometimes the fourth, fifth language, and where there were lots of different languages going on. And we did a sermon, which wasn't a sermon. It was really, let's look at Paul, depictions of Paul in paintings, and let's look at Jesus. And one of the things that was so interesting about it was that when Paul was preaching, the interpretations that all the painters had was that he stood at a distance from his audience and he spoke to them as a preacher. Whereas Jesus had to get away from people by standing in boats because they were around him all the time. And the paintings that you see of Jesus across history, right up until now, are of love. Whereas the paintings of Paul across history have this remoteness of, I am telling you something that is important and people are listening. But there is not the relationship, because Paul isn't talking primarily about the kind of love that Jesus was manifesting as he stood there. And I find that fascinating. So whenever I look at the epistles, I'm struck by how scholarly they are, how kind they are, how much they're trying to reach people who Jesus would reach just by being there.
Yes, they're very interesting. Now, and I'm sure somebody, we should have some defenders of Paul around.
I love Paul.
I don't know, but
I love Paul. He is our way in.
He is our way in.
Yes.
Now, if we've got those three readings, those three very different. No, there's three readings with differences in.
Yeah.
And we've had this before in the series. Some readings seem to speak directly to the world, and some speak very much to the church. And these ones, you'd say today, these are about matters of faith, and some of the issues that go deep to the heart of Christian religion, especially perhaps within the Reformed tradition as well. Is there anything in these readings that speaks to the world beyond our doors, would you say? Trying to connect it with the issues of around us?
Well, one of the sentences, which is wild and groovy as far as I'm concerned, is, "For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation." Now, you can read that two ways. You can read that where there is no, you can read it that to break the law brings anger from those in charge. But then there's also this odd add-on, which is where there is no law, neither is there violation. In other words, and he's only talking about Jewish law here. So what he's talking about is what he talked about earlier, which is when Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law unto themselves. In other words, there is something higher than the law. But he doesn't use love. So I sometimes think if you could have used love a bit more, we'd understand his texts better. But of course, he's a rabbi. So he's talking rabbi language. He's not a prophet. He's not, even when he's down on the ground, he's not down on the ground in the same way. So where there is no law, neither is there violation, means where our rules don't apply, neither does the violation of them. Now, you can look at that in terms of oppression and say, what does that say, supposedly, about the rules? There are rules that have to be broken to free people.
Interesting.
Yeah. I know perfectly well that there are points at which I would break the law if it's not in the interests of people, or if it's obviously not in the spirit of God's law.
Yes.
And I suppose what he's trying to mediate, what Paul is trying to mediate, is the difference between Jewish law and what he knows is God's law, because he's met Jesus on the road to Damascus. He doesn't want to diss law. He doesn't want to disrespect the Jewish law because he's built his entire life on it. Then he has had to break it all down, look at it and build it up again in a different way. But he doesn't use the word love.
But where there is a higher law, and that's a very, very great challenge. I like that. I often reflect. I've had in this study. I had a very difficult conversation once with a member of my congregation who joined us, and he came to me one day, and again, slightly like Nicodemus, came by night and he confessed to me that he was here illegally. He'd come on a student visa from part of Africa, but with no intention of studying, because he was the breadwinner. He was going to fund his family back home.
Yeah.
And he said, "What do I do? What do I do?" And what angered me was not his behavior, but the fact that he was working like so many other people he was a care assistant, a caring profession. And it was quite obvious that the subcontractors he was working for knew full well about his status and had arranged different means of paying him through an intermediary and all the rest of it. And they in turn were being contracted by the local council, who, if they had had any concern about this issue, could have investigated and found out. But there was complicity in it from all sides, because he was cheap and he would work. And as you know, in London, we are desperate, as in so many other parts of the country, for people who will work for minimum wage in the caring profession. So there was somebody who was breaking the law, but it was a higher law that was being broken. It was those in power who had really broken the law, and he was the victim. And I really struggled. And I in the end, I said to him, look, we can try and help you, but you are going to get yourself into real trouble if you do not come clean and confess to the authorities and say, this is my situation. I said, we can try and help you, and we could perhaps give you some money for a lawyer and things like that. But he and there's one of those pastoral encounters where you always think, what did I do the right thing? Because then he just disappeared from our congregation.
Yes, I've had this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yes. I've also, in terms of prostitution, I've thought about it a lot, because I used to live very near to a nice woman who, at the end of the month, her children, who were beautiful and beautifully brought up, were on bread and jam. And so by the end of the month, she went to the pub and she sat until somebody picked her up, and then somebody and she would say, yes, but only if you buy my week's groceries. Now, that is systemic sin. That is not her sin.
Yeah.
That is where somebody pushed into sin by the fact that her benefits did not stretch to her and 2 children. Now, that's not crime, but that's, if you look at law and higher law, that's exactly where we're at. Small people being oppressed by big systems.
And I think J-Pit as well has done a lot of work on benefits and benefit sanctions. And again, definitely, I have advised people to break the law with regards to benefits, I'm afraid, because I remember one chap was in such a complicated situation, but at that time, I'm not sure if it's still true, but after 6 months of being unemployed, you can keep some benefits even when you go into work. And he was like 5.5 months, and he said, I've been offered this job, but what? And I said, don't take it. Come back after 6 months, because otherwise he would have been destitute, because if the job had fallen through and he was a builder, that was it. That was his housing benefit, council tax benefit, everything gone, and he would have been back to square one, and he was struggling with alcohol. So I think there is that, you're right, the systems that set up and create sin. So perhaps there's that idea of coming by night with Nicodemus. That sort of coming covertly. How can we talk about these issues when there is complicity around breaking the law?
Yeah. Well, there's this lovely thing. It's a double thing, isn't it? There's coming by night because he doesn't want his colleagues to spot him, possibly learning something from somebody so contentious within the community, such a dangerous firebrand. But he is also benighted. He hasn't got yet what Jesus is about to tell him. So there's this lovely double thing of secrecy, and also he's in the dark until he talks to Jesus, and Jesus begins to explain it to him. And actually that ends up with a mention. Hang on, let me find it. No, I've lost it. This is going to be boring if I look for it, and I can't.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
But we have those words, God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that it might be saved. Yeah. And how often in our politics is it the politics of condemnation? And I think we are seeing this morning, very much on my mind. We've just been approached, our church, to help support some local asylum seekers who are going to a hotel. And of course, we have to be very strict and say nothing about it to anybody, because these people are going to be condemned. I mean, and we've seen that locally, and we've talked about this on this podcast before. So again, these people are effectively going to come to us by night to get. Yeah. We'll provide a bit of space to help them. I think, but they are being condemned. Whereas actually, we should be saying, how can we save them? How can we save them from the situation that is forcing them to flee? And going back to Abraham, forcing them to flee for a better life.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that I can't help thinking about with that phrase, politics in the pulpit, is how often churches stand by things that possibly the individuals no longer believe in. So collectively, churches will oppress or will eject or will not welcome people of a certain kind. So, for example, LGBTQIA is a perfect example of where I believe that very often people within church, individuals within church, are all in different places on the sexuality, and some of them may well be in different places sexually and from a gender point of view, and yet church goes on holding on. Many churches, I don't mean every church, churches go on holding on to something which needs the gentle exploring to find out whether church is church for excluding certain people. I was talking to a woman the other day who said that all the single mothers were put together in one part of the church separately for services. What's going on? You know, the condemnation that can happen in our own congregations politically, you know, small politics, petty politics, tiny fermenting politics, bullying. That's also part of what's going on. I know we should perhaps always be talking outwards about external politics, but I think the church that has dangerous politics inside it will also have dangerous attitudes towards some of the people we've been talking about now.
Yes. And I just had to look up because I was trying to get the exact quote, but one that often sticks with me is John Major. And that, I mean, frighteningly, that's 30 years ago now, which makes me feel very ancient. But his back to basics speech, he said, society needs to condemn a little more and understand a little less. And that always struck me, even at the time, as I was thinking, really? And I think, particularly pick up what you said, I think the issue of trans people are facing. I just think we need to have more conversation, and there needs to be a much more open conversation with people honestly expressing their doubts and fears and concerns. We need to hear the experience of trans people, but we need to condemn a little less and understand a lot more. Because and that applies to so many, and we come back to Jesus's words, which often been misinterpreted, but I have not come to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved. And saving the world, you know, does mean condemning certain things, probably. You know, we've talked about sinful structures and such like, but we must begin, as with John, about the conversation. And that's what's missing, I think, with the trans issue in particular, is most people have never encountered or knowingly encountered a trans person, and certainly not sat down and had a conversation with them.
Yes, because when you think that in the same way that we are all, I mean, this is so obvious that it's almost frightening to say it. Scarily, as as my father used to say, are you taking O-levels in the bleeding obvious?
Oh, I'll keep that one. I like that.
But I'm about to just do an O-level now.
Yeah.
Is, it takes a very long time for me to know a middle-class white woman of my age, because she's not going to have the same background as me. She's not going to have had the same dad as me, mum as me, dogs as me. Bleh. She won't have had the same developmental traumas as me, or she won't have had any. She won't have a black son, or she might. Who knows? Now, you add that to the journey of a trans person arriving at the point at which they want to trans. You may never hear about that because it's private.
Yeah.
Or it may not be private, but unless you're sitting and thinking, oh, that's interesting. I have that opinion. Oh, they're a conservative. Oh, they're a liberal. Oh, At the moment, I suppose, the trouble with the internet, and there are so many wonderful things about the internet, but the trouble with it is it speeds everything up.
Oh, yes.
Conversations which would have taken years and should take years, I believe, are going far too quickly. People's reactions, where they can post off something to poor J.K. Rowling in a moment, when they haven't thought through what the huge depth of what she was saying.
Yeah.
Very difficult. Luckily, she's not poor J.K. Rowling. She's just J.K. Rowling.
And there needs to be recognition that there is, and perhaps what we need is more Nicodemus-like situations where people can meet in private and just talk honestly. And we know today, of course, we're thinking about Northern Ireland. We know we got to the Good Friday Agreement, that historic agreement that very sadly the Brexit deal almost completely torpedoed. How did we get there? Not by the glare of publicity, but by, again, going back to John Major, actually, one good thing he did do was those very quiet, covert meetings that took place in private, in the darkness, between people, between enemies, essentially. And that is how peace comes about. It doesn't come about through press conferences. It comes through people meeting in great secrecy often to make those very first steps of understanding and saying, well, what can we agree on?
And personal trust.
Yes.
I mean, one of the personal trust things that has been broken is the Nicola Sturgeon personal trust, where everybody was trusting her on the Scottish independence, and then the age of 16 being a trans, this was by anybody's ideas was rushed. It should have taken a lot longer. So she suddenly lost credibility when her Scottish independence idea was gaining credibility and has gained credibility. So trust can be easily lost in politics. Well, it's very, very hard to gain because politics and estate agents are at the bottom together, aren't they, at the moment, apparently?
That and journalists. Politicians always point out that journalists are even lower than they are. Well, quite gleefully. But yes. Now, I think we've had a very good run around there of our readings today, and I hope we've given people some starters to think about. And I think especially perhaps the Nicodemus reading, visiting of somebody coming to Jesus, and displaying perhaps some of the faith that Abraham did as well, and what it might mean perhaps to love the world and condemn the world. Now, I'll just note, just before the end, I'm going to be naughty now and say, you said to me earlier, we won't do the psalm, and which I was very surprised about because you being a poet. because you said there's just too much in it. There's too much good stuff in it. Did you want to have any word at all about, and of course, the role of poetry, speaking as a poet, the role of poetry in scripture and in our everyday lives? Do you think
Yes, I would love to talk about it in a way. It was my mother's favorite psalm, and she adored it. You see, it's promising something which is unprovable. And it's one of these things that can easily be said, which is it's all going to be all right in the end.
Yeah.
And I worry about anybody who says this to someone when there are great big things to get over. I lift up my eyes to the hill, from where will my help come? And I remember my son going to his first ever Sunday school and being told that if he prayed, he would get what he prayed for. And I had to say to him, darling, that lady was lying, and we won't be going back to that Sunday school, because there are 3 answers to God says 3 different things: wait, yes, and no. And there's something about this beautiful psalm which is so soothing. I think it can be used at a deathbed. I think it can be used at a funeral. I think it can be used for comfort. But it's not telling the whole truth that some of the other psalms operate with. I mean, by the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept. It begins as a godly thought and ends up with an ungodly thought, which I would much rather be working with, because I don't believe that it's a helpful psalm. It's a beautiful psalm. It's a beautiful piece of worship. It's astonishing in so many ways. He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep, as opposed to Nicodemus, you're a teacher of Israel and you don't know that. But a very, very devout minister who I know says that that when people say God is always good all of the time, God is good all of the time, and we're thinking, yes, but it's more complicated than that.
Yes.
So there's, so the poetry of the psalm is bliss, and the promise of the psalm is, what shall I say, a bit empty for me.
Yeah.
It's a terrible thing to say about a psalm, isn't it?
No, that's fine. But just a very big question, just to finish up with, I'd like to ask you. We've got protest poets and poets who speak, and you, when you're on the Jeremy Vine show, had to produce a poem to reflect on the news that day. What can poets say that the rest of us can't, do you think? Or should they?
Okay, so there are probably 2 or 3 things. Poets can, for example, Isaiah, Holy Mountain. Isaiah is saying, one day we will get on with the Gentiles, and we will be able to get on with people who eat different food. Now, he couldn't have said that. So what he did was he talked about kosher and non-kosher animals lying down together. Now, a lot of his listeners back then would have understood what he was doing. We don't, unless we're thinking about it very carefully. But the poetry allows for you to say something far more daring than you're allowed to say in public, because you'll get stoned or something for it. So there's that. There's also poetry versus poems. Now, Mary in the Magnificat is saying, first of all, she's saying, wow, this is incredible. I've been given this opportunity. Who am I? I've been given this gift. Who am I? And then she's setting out the manifesto of her child. It's going to turn everything on his head. everything's going to be turned around. The first last and the last first type of thing. You can see where he got his politics from, can't you? He got it from his mummy early on. That's a poem. But the poetry of the Bible and the poetry of somebody who is setting out to do a series of poems about something can range very widely. Oh, the same with somebody who's a songwriter, where you can hear the themes going on and on and on. The themes of my poems tend to operate around that the Bible is still happening. I don't want to talk about the relevance of the Bible, because I believe the Bible is still happening. When I walk around in Wood Green, I see the same things happening. I see the prodigals. I see the prophets. I see the people standing on street corners. The Lazarus is dying of starvation. So there's an echo for me in everything that happens in the Bible, because it's happening now. It has not stopped happening. We need to go on interpreting our own lives by looking at what happened in the Bible, but allowing ourselves to catch up with the fact that, for example, Jesus never spoke against slavery. Jesus never clarified many things that we would love him to have done.
Yes. Oh, well, thank you for that, and encourage us to look again at the poetry of Scripture. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us this week, Lucy. Really enjoyed it.
I don't think it was wisdom, but it was.
Really enjoyed it, and perhaps we could think about who we think about Jesus and Nicodemus. We think about who in our society, who in our world would be good if they sat down together secretly at night and had a conversation. Who do we need to do that with?
Yeah, that's
and perhaps who is stepping out in faith this day, like Abraham. If you've enjoyed this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on Twitter at @pulpit_politics, or using the hashtag Politics in the Pulpit. We also have a Facebook group, which you can access through the Joint Public Issue Team's Facebook page and the website jpit.uk. That's jpit.uk. Let's go into both our politics and our pulpits this week with a blessing. Blessing of God the Father, who made from one every nation that occupies the earth, of God the Son, who bought us for God from every tribe and language and people and nation, and of God the Spirit, who brings us together in unity, be with you and remain with you always. Amen. Thanks for listening. See you soon. Goodbye and God bless.